Hello, this is Dr. Jack Unzicker from the University of Texas at Arlington. Today we're going to be working on the Kreutzer 18 Studies number 1, the Allegro Moderato. Tempo marking on this is between 80 and 90. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technical issues that come up when we're playing it at tempo, but mostly we're going to be working under tempo just to talk about some fingerings and some of the technical challenges and how to practice them. So if you have a quick moment to pause the video, go ahead and number your measures. That'll just let me move quickly from where we're going to be starting. But let's jump in right away and start at the beginning. Okay, so measure number 1. There are a lot of fingerings in this edition that are by Kreutzer, not really, but it was transcribed by Franz Simandl, bassist, and Fred Zimmerman, another bassist. So taking these violin etudes and making them work for the double bass, they've gone through a few different versions to get the fingerings that are here, and I'll even have some suggestions as well. So when looking at editions by such great players as Simandl and Zimmerman, it's great to see what they were thinking and to try what they were doing, and then also just to explore and see if there are any other options that might work better, or understand if they made some awkward choices, why they went about making those particular choices. So if we look right away at the beginning, we can see that Zimmerman's markings are 4, 2, 3, 1. So with 1 on F, and then the shift to 2, 4. And I think that has too many shifts in it. If we just play the harmonic by itself, just pivot to the harmonic and then come back to the same position, it looks like this. Compared to Zimmerman's fingering. Because we're going to use the harmonic one way or the other, I think it's fine just to stay in position, pivot for just the harmonic, and then come right back. So rather than first finger of the F, just go to 4. Okay, so starting on the D string, 4. And it's all the way there, halfway through measure 2, that we have our first change where we basically shift out of this position. So halfway through measure 2, so just going down the G string, basically shifting when you have to. Okay, and then I follow Zimmerman's fingering for measure 3, going to the D string for 4th finger. Okay, but I deviate a little bit, so this is the measure 3, second beat. The B and C he has marked with a 1-1, so doing a quick pivot with the first finger, and I've decided to play those in position 1-2 and then pivot to 4th finger on the A. So here's Zimmerman's. So it's just as a quick pivot. My decision is pretty similar, but it looks like this. So I guess you could say my fingering is a little more old school, where I'm actually shifting back to the B, playing the B and C in position, and then shifting back to the A, where Zimmerman was just doing a quick pivot back for just the B and then returning to the position that's organized around first finger on C, 4th finger on D. So try them both. That's my best advice for you. What we want to do is find out what our tendencies are and see what things are going to be most consistent with intonation and sound production. Here, because it's not changing anything that has to do with which string we're playing on during the passage, that's the same. It's just a matter of what's going to be cleaner, the shifts or the pivots. There are other spots later where we'll talk about when we have to make some choices about where the string crossings are and what the string crossing pattern is, and make some decisions of the pros and cons of different fingerings because of what it does to the bowing. Okay, let's look at the second line, so beginning at measure 4. We've already set it up to play the A minor arpeggios, where we're starting with 4th finger on the D string. So we'll play the first 2 beats similarly that we did in measure 3, but then we'll just go down the G string as needed, so shift when needed basically. So measure 4 again, and then we have a bit of a shift and a pivot, which is a little unusual. We end up with almost like a double shift. So when we go back from the second beat, we can go 1, 1, 2, 4. So essentially I'm not moving my thumb while I play those 3 notes, and that's the reason that we'll call it a pivot rather than double shift. So while I play those 3 notes, my thumb is staying in the same position, and it allows us to play some of these passages that are within a minor third or within a major third sometimes with very good speed and agility and great accuracy as well. As long as we're not trying to add to the mix and a finger extension as well or something like that. Okay, and then going on to bar 5. So for the first beats to play the F major arpeggio, I am pivoting. So just pivoting up for the C and then right back to first position. And then shifting up to the D and then shifting down as needed. Okay, and then that pattern continues throughout the rest of the line, and then in measure 7 we find ourselves back in the same fingering that we used earlier for the A minor arpeggio. Picking up at measure 7, so A minor arpeggio starting with 4th finger on the D string. Okay, and here's the first time that we'll talk a little bit about how fingerings can change what we're going to do with the bow. Whether we want to stay on the same string or to add more string crossings or to come up with a creative fingering that has fewer string crossings, but we end up using more strings. Confusing statement. Okay, so in measure 7, the first half of the bar is just as we've done before, but then when we switch to this F major arpeggio, two options here. So the one that I'm doing right now is to stay on the D string and to keep the bow from having to do a lot of jumping around if we're going to use the D string at all. Zimmerman's fingering, he actually has us staying on the G string for all of beat 4. So that would look like this from beat 3. So again with a quick 1-1 pivot in that case. So so just basically getting your hand back very quickly for the C natural with first finger and then pivoting right back to the same position. And again, this is one of those situations where you'll just have to try both fingerings and see which one works out better for you. Oops. Or okay, and what I would avoid is another option which has you going back and forth between the two, the G string and the D string, more often than that. So try those two fingerings. See which one you like. Okay, moving on to measure 8. So I would do the same fingering that you did in measure 7 at the end of measure 7 for the beginning, since it's the same music repeated again. So either keeping it more on the G string or more on the D string. As you can see, I'm leaning toward doing the last bit of that first 2 beats on the D string at this point in time, but I may change it as I work on it a little bit more. So measure 8, halfway through the bar, which is very, very similar to the opening of this particular etude, except for the first 2 notes. But everything else I would do the same way. So it's a 4th finger. Okay, and now we have our first little tricky moment where we have to get up into thumb position, and he throws a perfect 4th at us, which is not usually very comfortable on the bass, especially in this particular position. So getting up there, so this is from the beginning of measure 9. And you can tell that Zimmerman knew that it was uncomfortable because This is one of the few places where he gives us 2 fingering options, and I'm not using either of them. So the one that I'm doing is with thumb on G, first finger on E, and playing that fourth with a stacked fingering or a bridged fingering. There are a couple of different terms I've heard for it. But basically playing the perfect fourth with 2 different fingers, which is very common. And once you get the hang of it, you'll see that it's great to employ in other places, like we'll see later in this movement as well. Alright, and Zimmerman's fingerings there, he has given us starting in the second beat, which is very similar to the one that I'm doing, except that rather than playing the A with 2, you have to pick your finger up and put the same finger back down on the A. And I think you'll find that that's a little bit dangerous at a faster tempo. So at a slow tempo it might feel fine, but at a faster tempo, rather than, and it's following a shift into thumb position and so forth. So again, try them both and see what you think. The next half of the measure, I'm thinking about staying in thumb position here, so that once we get to this point, just going to the A string for the A, the lower octave A, and just playing the rest of the measure in thumb position since you're already there. Zimmerman's option is to go back to the D string, so you have, which is sounds great. It's nothing wrong with that fingering, but it gets you very quickly getting from, which I'm not crazy about that really quick shift, but it's a good second option if you don't have a bass that sounds very good in this register. So you just have to play them both and see what sounds the best, see what's most comfortable, and which is going to be more consistent with intonation and sound. And then we'll move on with measure 10 here in just a second. Going on with measure 10, I like Zimmerman's idea of going up and down the G string completely here, so from the harmonic and then just going to the open string afterwards. There are many different fingering options for these scales, so I would start with what Zimmerman had written and then see if there's any others that might be more comfortable for you. So what I've thought about doing here is employing a little bit of the open string where it's easy, and then where we have the octaves, just playing them across if I'm already on fourth finger, such as with the second half of 10. Okay, so going through that a little bit slower and talking about where the shifts are. So from the beginning of 10, just playing the open string and then 2 notes per position. Shift, shift. Okay, and so the E, F, the E, C, and F, and the low F could all be in position here. If you're comfortable playing in the F and G, that high up on the A string, it can be a very efficient fingering with very little moving around. Or we can go back down. Well, let's see. Or you can go back down to first position and so forth. If you do that, just keep in mind you can see the second fingering that I did works better if you do a 1-1 shift between the A and the B. So 1-1. It's just a more efficient fingering by the time you get up to the top. Okay, and then for the E octaves, I decided just to go down to the D string. It doesn't work very well to pivot around, at least for me, on that particular scale passage. And so there the shift is between the B and the C, this particular pattern. Okay, and then we're on the second half of measure 11. shift between the A and the B just to get ready for the next measure, for the downbeat of the next measure. Okay, and then similar fingering to what we've had so far. So the shift happening between the B and the C. And then the second half of measure 12. So there I just decided to make a shift on the D string so that I could get ready for the B and C and play them in position. So that would look like this. And then in 13, we'll get to in just a second. And we're continuing with measure 13 and these ascending scales. I'm going to jump back down into the lower positions once we play the downbeat here. But then up the D string to the A so that we can play the C in position just across the string rather than making a larger 1-1 shift. And then I'm going to go across to the A string for the octave from the F to F, which I did earlier in the piece. And it worked out well, so I'm going to stick with that idea. And it also sets us up very easily for the A and B on the D string, and then the D that follows on the G string without a whole lot of shifting around. So again, from the beginning of 13. Okay, and you can see that it's pretty organized, pretty efficient fingering-wise, rather than only going up and down the strings. Okay, and then from measure 14, so there's one where I am using the full length of the G string, if you will. So we play the downbeat, and it's very common for us to, when we are trying to make the fingerings very efficient, to do a 1-1 shift down low and half position to first position, or first position to second position, or something like that, so that the rest of the fingering works out well. Very common with scalar passages. So as you can see, I did a 1-1 there. Okay, and then depending on how you're going to play the second half of this bar would determine whether you go to thumb on the G or if you're going to use a first finger. If you're going to go back down, I would probably do 1-3 and then back down to the next note, to the A. If you're going to stay in thumb position, which I'm going to try here in a second, then I would go to thumb 1 for the G and A as we get up there. So from the beginning of 14 again. Oops, those aren't the right notes. Okay, and as you can see, if you stay in thumb position, the fingerings work out pretty well with the change from the high note to the low note in position, and then it cuts out a lot of the shifting that you would have to do if you keep jumping out of thumb position back into thumb position and so forth. So I'd recommend that you try it. So going to thumb position on the first G and A in the middle of 14, and just stay in thumb position. So there on that F and E, that's where I would recommend coming out of thumb position. But you can stay in there that long, and like I said, it cuts out a lot of shifts. Okay, let's pick it up again at measure 16. So we're in thumb position until the second beat, the end of the second beat. So there we're at second beat of 16. Come out of thumb position. So I think what you notice is that most of those patterns in this sequence, that I'm shifting for the last two 16th notes leading into the next sequence. So starting halfway through measure 16, here, So if you do a 4/4 shift on the FE, and then a 4/4 shift, it just sets the pattern up nicely so that we get at least 2 notes in each position before we have to shift again. So from the last 2 notes of 16, 4/4, and then down the G string. Same thing, 4/4. And here I make the exception. So at the end of 17, then I shift basically at the bar line so that I'm set up in the position, first position for the beginning of measure 18. So from the last 2 notes of 17, shift to 4. So you get all of those notes in the same position without having to add another shift. Okay, and that gets us through the line, measure 16 through 18. Okay, so now we'll move on with measure 19. So we're basically down in first position here at the end of 18. And then this next measure is basically organized around the harmonic, or at least the first half of the measure. So from the beginning of 19, let's go to 3 on the harmonic. So we only have the E that's closed that we have to pivot back for, and then we can play the G's and D's with just the harmonic. And then we got a 4th finger on the C on the D string, and the rest of the measure we've played similar music to that before. So from the beginning of 19, pivot, then just harmonics, and then back to 4th finger. And here I deviate from Zimmerman's fingering, which he has. Actually, I don't deviate from his fingering. We're doing the same thing. Okay, so that if you can play the B and the E and the A on position together, it sure makes the shift up a lot easier rather than trying to jump there from another. So if you have to shift back for the A and then up for the A, up the octave, it can definitely get the consistency of the shift or make it a little bit more difficult to play in tune. So go ahead and shift to 4/4. So 4 on the B, 4 on the E, and then into thumb position. So Zimmerman has some creative use of the thumb here, using it for the F natural and the E natural. So once you're in the position, you have a major third between the thumb and the 3rd finger, and then a perfect 4th as well. And getting this perfect 4th from E to A, it's very handy. It comes comes up very often in solo literature and in orchestral literature. So to work on that perfect 4th between thumb and 3, anytime you spend on it in this etude will come back, and you'll be able to apply it in other music as well. So from the beginning of 20, and while you're on the A, just move your thumb back, and then you're already in position to play the D harmonic with 1st finger, and then make the shift to 4th finger on F. And this is another stacked fingering where we use the 3rd finger to play the perfect 4th across the string from the G string to the D string. So let's see, from the shift back out of thumb position, so this is halfway through 20, bridged finger, okay, so we have a couple of shifts from A to A and B to B. Let's see, which finger are we on for that? 2 to 3. Okay, so I would work on those shifts independently, and then a little bit of fancy thumb work, and then everything else is pretty much in position. Okay, and we'll continue in a second with measure 22. Looking at measure 22 to the end, looks like we could play the downbeat of 22 either in position and on the D string, so we're coming from these harmonics at the end of 21. So you could play 3, 3, 1, or and go ahead and shift back to a lower position since the next note is going to be played on the D string most likely. So let's look at 22, let's say we go here. Okay, so just a couple of positions there, but we're utilizing a lot of the fingerings that we've used before. So organizing the C major arpeggio around this fourth finger on C on the D string. Okay, so here in 23, the BC here can be played either on the G string or the D string. And I would try them both. I would probably go up the D string. In that case, you can use the open G to make the shift, and it can be much cleaner when you have that opportunity. Then going on. So utilizing that same, using the open G to make the shift between the C and the E so that we can make the C major arpeggio both ascending and descending as clean as possible. Using the open G and playing the C on the D string. Very handy fingering to have. At the very end, I would just make sure that you don't play the top C too short in order to try to get down to the low C in time. So if you're playing, just try to make sure that you get enough length on the top note so that it doesn't sound like la 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 ka dum. Right? Even if the C is delayed, the low C is delayed a little bit, it'll still sound better than if the top note is suddenly shorter than everything else. So I'll play it both ways and you can tell me which one you like better. Notice how that short note sticks out and it seems a little bit out of context. So just if you need to take just a little bit of extra time to make sure that that top note has the right amount of length, it's better to delay the last note. And actually could be very musically very gratifying to end the last note and have it just placed a little bit further back. So I think that'll be, as a listener, much more enjoyable than if we just kind of barely touch the top note and try to race down to the very last note and try to play that directly in time. I think you'll find it's more musical and more satisfying just to play it with a nice amount of length.